The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. Yeah, so if you want to run me through what you've been running, we can sort of take a look and make sure the process is kind of in the right territory, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I had planned.
Just getting a little confusing about some of the finer points when you get into it. So
Sure, no
am
problem.
I sharing now? Let's see, share.
Should come through in a second if you are. Yeah, looks like it's just about to come through.
Okay. So this is,
Yeah.
How do I get rid of this green screen here? Okay, great.
Cool.
All right. So this is,
So this is
hijack button, big blind, Hunter, big blind, Jack 8-2.
Yeah.
This is using, these are wide ranges.
Sure.
Button and big blind. And
Yeah.
the middle position is just opening up sort of a GTO 21% range. So that range there, so that when I get to the preferred strategy is like 25%. So I'm looking at that strategy. So 25%, and the button calls, big blind folds, and we're on to like an ace of club. So what I did was I ran that one, and then when I got to the middle position, his betting strategy, I went down to the bottom, and I captured this.
Sure. Yep.
This strategy here. Okay, so that was why that was necessary.
Yep.
Okay, and then I go into. This is the same one. Let me just get this. I go into a turn sim.
Yep.
That uses the GTO response, which we just looked at.
Yep. Okay. All good so far.
Oh, these screens are so small.
You can maximize them. You just click the square button in the top right corner. You can maximize.
Yeah, I just have 4 or 5 of them open at once. So
I'm trying
to get to them all. So so this is the, so then this is that 7.4% turn range.
Yep. Going
to the turn range with a GTO response.
Yeah.
So he's got a 15.5% response to middle position. Big blind is no longer in the hand. Okay. Sure. So that strategy looks like a 64% check. Okay. And then, so then what I did then is I took that GTO response and I used the same 7.4 from that we've been working with, and I created a practical response.
Okay.
And that included lots of these 0.338s are back doors and front doors.
Okay.
And I'm not sure quite how accurate like some of the percentages are, but so that's kind of a work. I don't know what is asking me about a note taker. Okay, so that's so we're at that point here, and then we have we still have a 70% check because we're versus using a middle position 7.4, which would be wider than that. That's practical. And then this is one that is using. This is using a wider range that I created. And that same curated practical range. Yeah. And this one jumps up to 90% betting.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing already some of the effects of what you're doing here, which is helpful, because what it's showing you is that the fact that your range is so heavy on value after you bet the flop is now showing up on the turn in such a way where you have just a massive range advantage, right? You have 38% second pair here, if you look at the categories. Right. And that's just going to naturally create a situation where you have very few weak hands. So you just are kind of you're in like a very depolarized sort of strategy here where you have a lot of incentive to be betting smaller with a higher frequency. And that's going to be very different to the other situation, because in the other spot, the optimal strategy, you were not betting the flop with all your Jack X, right? So that's kind of why you're seeing what you're seeing.
Right. So when I finally get to, I should finally get to a practical range that I curated myself, the
Sure.
hands that I think I should be playing.
Yeah.
This strategy that I created is a little bit weak in the checking node. Like my checking node is probably pretty weak. Like I'm
Yes.
front loading
On the flop. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's well, not the well, the one I curated, yeah, into the turn. Yeah, the one I got to the turn with. It's
Mhm.
probably weak in the checking range. When I check, it's pretty much check folding. But well, I'm betting most of the range here in this particular example. What I'm confused about, not more like what does it mean, but like just the process. What am I when I finally get to a curated practical range for me and a practical range for the opponent, and I get to this sim that we're looking at here,
Yeah.
what am I comparing that to?
Well,
Am I
the short version there is you want to run a bunch of different turns with this same setup. So what I would do is I would start with the ace of clubs, and then okay, we've run that one. Maybe we also run the deuce of clubs. We run the nine of spades. We run the nine of hearts. We
right?
run a bunch of different turn cards and get an understanding of, based on the strategy that you're employing on the flop, and then the response the villain is likely to have in practice. What is your turn strategy going to look like depending on the turn card? And
Right.
which turn cards are you going to have the ability to play polar? Which turn cards are you going to play more aggressive, less aggressive,
Right.
and so on?
Right. Sometimes the bigger bet comes in, but the
Sure.
that is you have to re-curate the calling range of the or the no because
No,
like
you actually don't. You
you
don't
don't
have to
yeah
do
you
any.
don't
Yeah,
have to
you don't
do
have to do any re-curating at all. That's kind of the advantage of this. That
right
once you have two ranges that represent a roughly realistic idea of what each player is going to have when they come out of the flop, all you then need to do is run a bunch of different turns, and you're going to from that have not just the turns but also the rivers, and then from the basically what you're doing is you're saving a lot of time here, right? Because instead of node locking all three streets, what you can now do is you don't have to node lock the flop. You can just, if you want to node lock the turn and see how that affects the river, you can, but you can start to get a much clearer perspective here in a very specific kind of a betting line of how certain turns and rivers are supposed to play out, or how they will play out with the actual strategies that you're implementing. And
right
if you do see stuff like this, for example, if you do see certain turn or river scenarios where against the specific strategy that you're playing against, your strategy looks wildly imbalanced in one direction, then that's going to clue you in that something may have gone a bit off on an earlier street. In this case, it's that you're actually betting too much Jack X on the flop,
right
and you probably would benefit from checking a bit more, especially with some of the medium to weaker Jack
right.
X and so on, right?
I really like the exercise of curating both ranges, but once I make my range and make their response, I think that I have to be careful comparing that to GTO versions where GTO, I'm playing a GTO strategy and he's playing a wide strategy, because I
Right.
think that we're not comparing apples and apples anymore.
Yeah. And I think
Even though our betting range went from like 30% up to 90%, it's apples and oranges.
it is, but it's also, even if you just run two sims where you have your GTO range versus his GTO range, and then your GTO range versus his suboptimal range, immediately you're from that. If you run the turn card, if you run different turn cards, you're going to get a sense of how does it affect the turn strategy just in a vacuum, what happens on the turn purely as a byproduct of him being wider. And then from that, when you also change your own strategy, now you're layering on top of that. How does that affect the turn when I'm not playing a GTO strategy? Because you're not playing a GTO strategy.
It is a little confusing in that when you're looking at GTO versus his curated wide range overcalling, then we change our range. It's kind of like, again, I don't know if it's confusing to me that we're looking at the same thing.
Well, that's the main thing that we're doing is the reason why we're changing our range, and the reason why we're curating our own range is because the only way to not do that would be to go through the process of node locking the flop and then rerunning the flop.
We could just take the GTO range that we normally played against a GTO opponent. We could take that range and pop it into a new sim. But
Well,
that
we
range
certainly
wouldn't be correct because he's not playing GTO response. He's playing I'm kind of just talking through this and I'm kind of getting it as we
sure,
talk.
sure.
He's playing a wider, he's deviating, and we need to change our strategy and curate our own strategy versus his, once we know his player type that he's calling wide.
Yeah, and
Does that
it's
make sense?
also it does make sense, but it's also one thing that we need to take into account here is that whatever we are looking at on the flop as being the GTO strategy, we are not executing that in practice, right? Your actual approach for the flop in practice is not a GTO one because nobody's is, right? So
Right.
what you want is to understand not how am I supposed to play the turn in a circumstance where I somehow know exactly what frequency I'm supposed to use B25 with this exact
Right.
range of hands.
Right.
Because you're honestly the idea that your range looks like that going into the turn is just as unrealistic as the idea that villain's range is GTO going into the turn. So what we want to do is we want to start to understand based on our best effort at approximating a well-rounded flop strategy, and then villain's best effort at doing whatever villain wants to do.
Right.
How are these real world turn and river situations going to actually
Right.
play out? Because they're looking back at the flop there. You ran the flop with like 3 sizes, and the B25 size was one of just 3 sizes that are used. I can absolutely guarantee you that whatever you're doing in practice looks absolutely nothing like that B25 range. There's just no way because nobody's does, right? You don't have 3 sizes on a multi-way spot in practice. You don't have mixed frequencies. You're not randomizing like all of this stuff. So
Right. So we should go right to the turn and curate our own ranges from the turn.
I think generally that's a better way to do it because
Right.
the other option would be to start at the flop, node lock every part of the flop to see, okay, what's our optimal flop strategy supposed to look like based on our assumptions about villains
Right.
flop strategy. And then from that node lock that we do and the strategy that it gives us, we would then have to take what is the version of that we could hypothetically implement in practice? Because it's entirely possible that the optimal node lock strategy for the flop is going to require us to use all kinds of mixed frequencies with different sizes, and it's just not going to be feasible. So what I would do to start with at a bare minimum is I would run a sim that only allows us to have one flop size. And that flop size should represent the type of size that you think you realistically would be picking on this type of board.
B25, B33, something like that.
Sure. If you go with that and you go one size, from that point, you can start to curate a strategy for the turn that looks more realistic for yourself. But
Nice.
I can absolutely guarantee you here that one of the reasons why this turn size looks really weird and it's hard to imagine playing this way in practice is because what you're seeing in terms of a flop strategy that you're actually carrying forward to the turn in the sim is nothing like a real flop strategy that you would actually implement. So I think the main thing here is if we're looking at things if we're trying to make things as practically useful as possible, we have to accept and recognize that our best attempt at a well-rounded flop strategy is not going to look anything like an optimal flop strategy. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, it does. It does. Yeah. So I think I'm on the right track.
I think you are, yeah. But I think the main thing here is that when we're looking at comparisons, what we're trying to do is we're not necessarily trying to compare our strategy in this practical spot to our strategy in a GTO spot. We're trying to look at this practical situation. How do these variables affect our strategy on this turn card compared to a different turn card, compared to another turn card, and so on?
Yeah.
Because
so I ran this several different ways. I ran the flop for GTO. I ran the flop for GTO versus wide. Then I ran the turn 4 different ways. And I think I could probably skip a bunch of these steps. Do I need the GTO range that arrives for us on the turn rather? Do I need that range?
Not really.
To compare it
like
to?
I think you want to, if your goal is to study the turn, it's more important to study the turn based on a reasonable assumption of what your actual flop strategy would look like. But it's also important to some degree that if you're studying the turn, you have to go into that with some level of confidence that you're not absolutely punting with your flop strategy. So as long as you know that your actual real flop strategy is not so far away from optimal, you're going to be fine to proceed to looking at the turn. But and in this case, like if you have like a moderately aggressive flop strategy on Jack 8 deuce and you're using B25, B33, yeah, you're not punting. But if you're in a situation where you have no familiarity with what a certain flop is supposed to look like 3 ways or 4 ways or whatever, I would start that situation by running a flop sim to check that your assumptions about what your strategy should look like on the flop are not so far away from accurate that it's actually causing you to be punting already.
Right. So this is the GTO strategy on the flop.
Yeah.
For once big blind checks to us,
Okay.
3-way. So
Yeah.
this is we're only betting 33% of the time.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So yeah, because it's not particularly a favorable flop. We are mixing pretty much all over the board except for like ace king and ace queen. Some of the ace.
Yeah.
Ace,
and
ace
this is broadly going to be the case. And this is the thing about multi-way scenarios, that there are quite often a lot of situations where EVs run very close together. This is a good example of a board texture where if you've got 3 reasonably wide ranges like this, it's not going to be a board that excessively favors one player or another. And it's not going to be that easy to simplify it to, I'm going to bet this frequency, or I'm going to, take this kind of a strategy in a vacuum. I would say certainly running 3 sizes on the flop it's only really useful for getting a sense of what kinds of sizes you can potentially use. But in a lot of cases, it's just going to avoid large sizes altogether.
Right.
So
this is not using the bigger sizes.
Right.
But once we check here, though, that he has a pretty aggressive strategy.
Yeah. And this is going to be, a pretty decent rule of thumb that the player who's last to act here is usually going to be able to bet at, approximately somewhat either side of half the time once we check to them, unless it's a particularly bad board or a particularly good board.
This is like a kind of a neutral flop here that we're not going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is why
But once we do check and he does call, once we bet and he does call,
yep,
then we get how accurate it is, but we get into this is the solve from the flop, so it's not as accurate, but we get middle position is not betting hardly at all here.
And it's because specifically you're not
his
betting
response.
You're not betting the flop with a lot of ace high, and he's calling the flop with at least some ace high. But it's also because when he calls the flop with a player left to act, he's going to have a jack at a pretty decent rate. If you flip to his range here, he has a jack he has a second pair 11% of the time. He has an ace 15% of the time. So he really just doesn't have that much no pair. And when he does have no pair, he mostly has a draw. So his range is just not that weak here, right? So
but when we take his range and we add lots of hands to it, and we add the fact that he's calling with all his flush draws and some of his bigger backdoors and some of his gut shots and whatnot, he's calling pretty wide here. So then we jump up to changing our range and betting a lot more on this turn. I think it went up like 70%.
On this specific turn, yeah, absolutely. Because it's going to be a turn that generally is going to be quite unfavorable for a lot of that weaker stuff that calls the flop in his case. Yeah. But obviously on a different turn card, it would interact very differently with both ranges. So that's why it's important that we look at a few different turn cards here and try to get a sense of, generally speaking, what directions are our strategy going in.
And it doesn't make any sense to look at this from a flop solve because it's not accurate enough.
I especially I saw on the flop you ran it with like 500 and 500 as the turn and river abstraction. Excuse me. Yeah, that's not going to be accurate enough to really
get a perfect and 500 on this.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I saw the other one. Yeah, I mean that's going to give you like a general idea. Like it's not. At 4.7 entropy, your turns and rivers are going to be still fairly unsolved.
I just want to get the flop ranges that are going to the turn as a baseline.
Yeah.
So I think go
ahead.
I think that if I run one, at GTO for a baseline, and then I can run the turn solves. And again, I'm just to reaffirm that we're not really that necessarily comparing the two different sims on the turn, but we can compare the GTO versus the wide range and the curated versus the wide range.
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to get a sense of how each different variable impacts the outcomes. And the
Don't get too
final,
hung up on that. More so experiment with different.
yeah, absolutely. Because you're not playing in an environment where any of your opponents are even remotely close to an optimal strategy.
Should I
And
bother running reports on different turn
no,
cards, or is that too?
no, I don't think you need to run reports at this point. The main thing, like, honestly, if you never ran an aggregate report again, you'd be fine. Like
I don't have that much turn stuff done, but you know that show that the futuristic show where they're all in the office and they just grab all these numbers and it's a new thing on HBO.
Severance, yeah.
Severance, yeah. So I go into severance mode.
Yeah.
Well, I'll sit here for hours and just do mindless work.
Yeah.
So
and
like,
I completely get the desire to do that, but at this point, the thing about it is you're like every hour you spend doing that, you're getting diminishing returns, because at this stage, what's going to be more important is the mechanics of how you arrive at a decision in game based on the parameters that are presented to you. So that's why I wanted to shift today into looking at the hand that you posted as an example of how you're thinking about these spots. Because there's a couple of things from that hand specifically already that.
Yeah, I added the notes after the fact, and I didn't think it through. I was just hearing, but it was some obvious. But if I could walk it through with you, I could probably clarify your ideas on what my understanding is. I pretty much knew where I was at, but however, towards the end of the hand, I'm betting for no reason at all, really.
Yeah, so, and I think that the hand is a good example of how there's diminishing returns on trying to be more and more precise on the earlier street, because there are a number of different flop strategies on that particular flop that could quite easily have almost identical EVs. But once you start to get into turns and rivers, there are a lot of things that would, diverge pretty heavily from each other in terms of EV. And as soon as you mentioned, I should probably shove here on the turn, I was like, whoa, okay, slow down, because you absolutely can't shove there, right?
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
you mentioned that, and I was like, okay, we got to break this down. So
it'll be good to break it down anyway. I need a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to start with is I want to show you a graphic that I got to reclaim the hosting privileges. I want to show you a graphic that I use to think about sizing choices on a range level, right? So how we think about sizing from a perspective of our range. Is that coming through? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, this is true. This is relevant multi-way, just the same way it's relevant heads up. It applies to pretty much any situation. And it basically just allows us to understand how, if we're just picking a fairly simple single sizing strategy, which we're going to do in a lot of cases, it allows us to understand how our strategy is presenting our opponent within different spots, or how we're incentivized to build our strategy based on what the ranges are that get to a certain spot. It all comes down to how many hands exist at the very top end and the very bottom end of our opponent's ranges, because in general, hands that exist at the top end are going to influence how much ability we have to take aggressive lines with the top of our range and to try to get thin value, with certain hands for big pots. And then the hands at the bottom end, how many hands our opponent has that are just going to be, for example, automatic folds in any given spot. That's going to influence how much incentive we have to just play the entirety of our range aggressively, or to take range bet lines and so on, for example. We always want to be looking at a spot in terms of the very top end and the very bottom end of our opponent's ranges. What we don't want to think too much about, and which most people think far too much about, is middle strength hands. Everyone just jumps to like draws and hands that are like kind of okay in a given spot. But bottom line is that those hands have very, very little influence on the actual strategic priorities that we would have in a given situation. Our opponent could have a range composed entirely of draws. And if that was the case, it just doesn't really matter what we do. And in fact, we would still get to play very aggressively, because
we're ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Draws are just not strong hands. But bottom line is that very weak hands, very strong hands, those are going to be the ones that influence our strategy the most. So if we look at the different axes of this graphic here, along the y-axis here, you've got basically the correlation between the size that we're going to be able to bet and then the amount of automatic raising hands, or potential automatic raising hands, that our opponent is going to have. If they have almost no hands that are going to be able to raise when we bet because they just don't have very many strong hands, then we're going to be able to shovel in a lot of money. We're going to be able to put in a lot of bets. If they have quite a lot of hands that could at least consider raising, I should probably change this from auto raises to potential raises, I guess. But if they have a lot of those hands, then we're going to have a lot less incentive to just shovel in big bets, right? So that's
like on a medium pair board, like on an 8-8 board.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of paired board in general where our opponent can have a lot of trips, that's going to be a pretty major factor there. But of course, if our opponent couldn't really have trips very often, so if the board was 3 deuce deuce and they just never really have a deuce, well, now that portion of their range is largely removed, so we're not really very concerned about it. So it's not all paired boards, but it does apply to a lot of paired boards. So that's the first kind of variable here, that we've got the y-axis of our sizing in relation to how many raising candidates or raising hands our
So
opponent
that's their aggressive responses.
Yeah, basically, they're aggressive responses. And then the x-axis here is going to track this arrow should probably go the other direction here. I should flip this around, but anyway, the general idea here, let me see if I can
fix it. There you go.
Doesn't matter. I can fix it. I'll fix it later. It doesn't matter. The idea here is that if our opponent has very few hands that have an automatic fold to any kind of a bet size here, if they don't really have very much in the way of folding in their range, then we're going to veer towards a range check. And this might be applied in situations where, let's say we open, we get flatted by somebody who has position on us, we get flatted by the button, something like that. And the flop comes, 3 low cards connected, so 6, 5, 4, something like that. On a board like that, it's entirely possible our opponent would have very few hands in their range that would ever fold if we were to bet small, or they would have very few hands that would be kind of an auto fold to any bet size there. So that might be naturally conditioning us to not do any betting at all. Because if we never get a fold, betting doesn't serve much of a purpose as a overall approach for our range. So on the left side, we have basically range check. Anything where our betting range is very restricted, or if it's lower than, if we're betting 10% of our range or something, we may as well just range check. So for the most part, we can simplify a lot of those situations in that way. And then we've got the other side of the spectrum where villain has, a lot of, actually, I guess this is, this is the wrong week.
Yeah.
Many.
I'm just gonna
That's what I
go
wanted.
crazy here.
Yeah. No, never mind. I just had it labeled wrong. That's fine.
That's okay.
So if they have a lot of auto folds, if they have a high frequency of auto folds, board texture where they just have tons of hands that completely miss the board, then we're going to be able to range bet, right? We're going to be able to have just a very simple range bet strategy. And sometimes we may take a range bet for a larger size. If villain has very few raising hands and a lot of obvious folding hands, we're going to get to do a high frequency of betting with a larger size, right? If villain has very few auto folds and a lot of potential raises, we're not going to get to do much betting at all. And these numbers in the grid here just simply are just useful descriptors that we can apply to different parts of or different strategies, basically, right?
So this would relate to a range advantage and nut advantage. We could bring those in somehow.
You can, yeah. But I think those concepts it's a little harder to factor those in a practical sense, because quite often we can have a nut advantage in a lot of situations where just having a nut advantage alone isn't necessarily enough to tell us that we should, use a big size. If, for example, like if we open under the gun and the flop comes ace, ace, deuce, we're going to have a nut advantage on that board. We're going to have a lot more strong ace X hands than our opponent can, but that doesn't mean we should bet big. It's still a small bet board because we still have no incentive to use a big size because of how easy it makes villains' decisions. So what this does is it encapsulates both of those concepts, but it goes a bit of a step further into allowing us to actually identify the mechanisms that help us to make better decisions, as opposed to just categorizing boards in a certain way that maybe is useful to some degree, but also not nuanced enough to allow us to really, make sizing choices in kind of an effective way. So this is the framework that I like to employ. And this is very relevant in all kinds of spots, but particularly flop and turn, really. It does still kind of relate to the river, but the river is a little bit different in terms of how we're
Right.
structuring some of our decisions. But in a broad sense, if we're picking single size strategies, this is a very reasonable approach that we want to take. So if we look at the hand that you mentioned or the hand that you sent,
What about the ace ace deuce? Before
What
we
do you
get
mean?
onto that,
What do you
like,
what do you
about
mean?
the ace ace deuce board? Where would we lay on this chart with that?
Well, where do you think we would lay if we
I mean,
had?
from what we just discussed, it would be a small bet on
Yep,
one frequency.
exactly right.
But
Yeah,
how so? Because does he have a lot of auto raises on that board?
I wouldn't say necessarily auto raises. Many, let's say, potential value raises.
On
I'm
the,
gonna put
on
that
the
in there,
ace
right?
deuce deuce board, really?
Well, what ace deuce is the
Ace
answer.
ace deuce.
Yeah, some potential. Well, what hands on ace ace deuce could villain consider raising for a value?
Well, any ace X.
Yeah, exactly. So that it's as simple as
Right.
that, right? When villain has an ace, any ace on that board is strong enough that it can at least think about raising for a value.
Right.
So in general, ace ace deuce is not ace ace anything is not a board where we have much incentive to really use a big size.
What about
because
ace king deuce?
same process. Would villain have many potential value raises on that board?
No.
No, absolutely not, right? Because
No.
they can't have aces, they can't have kings.
Right.
Ace deuce, king deuce suited, maybe. There's a few of those in
Right.
there.
So
It's
we're
not gonna be
overbetting. We're overbetting on that board for a small frequency.
doesn't have to necessarily be a small frequency either, right? Because come to think about what the range has in terms of auto folds, right? Does our opponent have a lot of auto folds? They have a decent chunk of them. They don't have a ton because they have a lot of ace and king high hands that flop top pair or second pair there. So it wouldn't necessarily be a low frequency bet here because it's not necessarily the case that they have very few auto folds, but it's also not really the case that they have many either. So we're probably going to end somewhere in the middle here. So we're probably going to go
queen jack, queen 10. They're going to have some draws.
right. And so they're basically, I think what we're at is, on an ace king deuce, we would be like a number 2 or a number 3 strategy here, where we're betting relatively often, but it's not a range bet. And when we do bet, we're betting a big size.
Okay.
Ace
Thanks.
deuce, we would go with like high frequency, small size, range bet very small there, I think is going to be fine. And we can apply this same logic in a bunch of places. Now, if we look at the situation that you were in, 3 ways, 8, 8, 7, you can still use this logic very easily. You just have to apply it to the collective ranges of our opponents as opposed to just one opponent. So where do we think they're at in terms of, first of all here, how many potential value raises does our collective opponents' ranges have on that 8, 8, 7 board?
I would say some to many.
Yeah, I would say so too, because any 8 is a potential value raise,
Exactly.
right? They certainly don't have to be super concerned about running into better when they have any 8 here, because it's low frequency that they do run into the other 8.
Right.
So they certainly have, at worst, some potential value raises, and at best, many potential value raises, which means what we can do is we can start by ruling out some of this graphic, right? We can rule out these top 2 rungs here of this graphic because we know we're not going to be able to use a big bet. And in fact, we can probably rule out the 3rd rung here as well. So it's probably just going to be either we bet one way or another, whether we bet more often or less often here. We know for sure that because we do have quite a lot of potential value raises in our collective opponents' ranges, it's going to be a small bet if we do bet, right? So that's the first part. Second part is how many auto folds do they potentially have collectively in their ranges here? What do you think there?
They're going to call with overs. They're going to call with anything that around the 8 and the 7. So I don't think I say very sub to very few auto fold.
Okay, so talk me through. They're going to call with overs here. Talk me through that sentence. Like, what type of overs are we talking about? Are we talking any 2 over cards?
King jack, queen jack, any broadways.
So 3 ways here. If
Not
they have
any broadways. Broadways, jack high broadways.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a huge difference, right? That's the thing. Like, there's a massive difference between both players are calling with any Broadway cards here versus they're calling with specifically Jack 10 or Jack 9. That's a huge difference because there's tons of combos of Queen Jack offsuit, King Jack offsuit, king 10 offsuit, queen 10 offsuit, ace 10 offsuit, all of those offsuit hands, it's really important that we don't just lump those together and say they're calling every overcards. Because if they are, that means they basically are never folding here. And truthfully, I think it's super unrealistic that we could ever expect our opponents to be passive enough that they have king jack offsuit and it comes 8-8-7 and we bet 3 ways and they just think, yeah, I have 2 overcards, I call. I just don't think people play that way.
So get you in my game.
Okay. One way or another, right?
I get it.
If they do play that way, right, then we're now in a position where it would be almost a necessity that their pre-flop ranges would also be wide enough that they would now have even more hands in those pre-flop ranges that would now
be auto folds,
become auto folds, right? That's the thing. It's not really consistent that somebody would be not that wide pre-flop, but then when they get to the flop, they just refuse to fold anything. It doesn't really compute that they would play that way. So bottom line, I think where we arrive here is that even if they do occasionally defend with some of those hands that are absolute trash here, it's some auto folds. I don't think it's many because they both have every pocket pair up to like 9s or 10s in their range, right? Which means they have quite a decent chunk of pocket pairs that aren't going to fold here. They both have a decent chunk of hands that have a 7. They both have straight draws, and they might continue with, some ace high backdoor type stuff, things like that. So I think bare minimum, we're going to be at some auto folds. I don't think we're going to ever be at many here, but I also don't think we're going to be at very few, because even if they're continuing all their broadways, like they're not continuing like queen 5 with a backdoor here and stuff like that, right? So there's still going to be at least some auto folds in there. So we've already kind of established that we're probably in the bottom 2 rungs of this. And I think we can establish further than that we're probably somewhere in the middle here in terms of frequency. So we're probably at like an 18 or a 14 here, something like that, right? We're at like small bet, moderate frequency.
I'm sorry, Matt. What do the numbers indicate?
They're just the reference point, so I can tell you which block I'm referring to.
Okay.
So it's just literally just labeling them according to,
okay.
so that I can,
okay.
Yeah, exactly. So that you can know which block I'm talking about. So middle bottom block here is 18, just arbitrary. So like something like a number 18 or 19 strategy could be fine here. The wider our opponent's ranges get, the more we might shift from an 18 to a 19. We probably would never go to a 20 because unlikely we can justify a range bet 3 ways in this spot.
So moderate aggression means moderate frequency.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, maybe I'll just rephrase that to moderate frequency. So something like half the time. And I think in a multi-way spot, moderate frequency might mean a third of the time, 40% of the time. It's going to vary, but I think small bet, medium frequency is going to work out pretty well as an overarching kind of a strategy here. And then within that strategy, I think you had aces in this specific spot, and I think aces is a very reasonable hand to put in that checking range because it's not really, it's not ideal to think that we would just bet all of our overpairs on that flop. We do, if we're going to be checking about half the time, we're going to want to have, some degree of protection in that range here. And I have a completely separate graphic of how we make decisions on a hand level here. But I think I want to kind of mostly go through this next time. I think I don't really want to talk too much at this point about the specifics of individual hands. I want to keep focused on the range here because the same process can be replicated once we get into the turn. So the flop checks around, and then the turn is the 10 bringing a flush draw, right? So let's just say it's a 10 of hearts, whatever it is, 2 hearts on the board. So it's 8, 8, 7, 10. Big blind checks. So first of all, what interpretation are you making about the big blind's range based on the fact that they check the turn here?
Well, I think it's pretty normal that they're going to check with their drawing hands, not having to face, they're potentially going to face a raise or not from me, but they're not going to made a bet with their drawing hands that are going to maybe be pushed off with a raise.
Slow down a sec. Why did we go straight to the draws?
Oh, well, we don't have to. We can look at the made hands. The medium strength made hands are going to.
No, don't start with the medium strength hands either. Start with the top.
Well, they're capped. They don't have pairs bigger than 10s. say. Let's say.
Well, they didn't have those pre-flop. Let's be really clear about starting from the top down and what that means here, right? It means looking at the strongest available hands on this board and then progressively looking to see,
Okay.
do those hands still
Right.
exist
So
in
they're
villain
going to,
range,
they're going to,
right?
looking to check raise with trips. They're not going to
Well,
bet out.
that slow down again.
Full house.
Trips isn't even the strongest available hand here, right?
Each 7.
Stop, slow down, please. Let me just explain the point that I'm making. We start from the full houses here, right? We start from the best available hands. Are those still present in the range? The full houses in this case, it would be 10-8, it would be 8-7, pocket sevens, quad eights even as well, which you can just lump in with the full houses. Basically anything that has, or pocket tens as well, anything that has a full house, it is feasible that they would consider trapping with those hands, that they would check those hands with the intent to check raise. But at the very least, we can assume that they might bet them at some frequency as well. We don't know for sure how often they're trapping and how often they're not. But we can assume the frequency of those one way or another is going to be very low just because it's very hard to have a full house. The next category down, what's the next category down after full houses?
Trips and sets.
Nope.
Is there a made straight out there?
It's 8-8, 7-10. So you tell me.
Yes. So it'd be,
Okay, there we go.
Jack 9.
Yeah. And what else?
6-8. Those 6.
9-6. 9-6.
9-6.
Right. Yeah. So big blinds range here. Jack 9 offsuit, Jack 9 suited, 9-6 suited. All of those could potentially be in the pre-flop range. Jack 9 suited certainly is. Do we think that they can still have those hands once they check this turn? Probably very unlikely. I think it's probably pretty reasonable to assume that the majority of their straights are going to bet this turn. They're not as likely to sort of play super trappy with a straight as they would be with a full house. So we can start to remove the majority of those straights from their range here. Then we have trips. Well, I think we can treat trips pretty much the same way we can treat a straight here. It's probably not strong enough to consider playing super trappy with in the way that a full house might. And they're also likely to be a bit more worried about getting sucked out on by a flush draw or a straight draw or something like that. So I think a lot of their trips, we would assume that they would likely bet on this turn as well. And from there, as we kind of go progressively downwards, we don't have to be as concerned about those portions of the range because those are not, super strong value hands. So we've looked at the top of the range down, and we've now arrived at the idea that really the majority of their hands that are very strong here to the point where they're looking to play a big pot, the majority of those hands would probably bet this turn. So you're right that they're fairly capped. Outside of full houses, outside of some super trappy stuff, they are pretty capped here. And that kind of obviously makes things much more favorable to us in this case. So first of all, we have, the variable about with regard to the big blind that we're interested in is they have very few potential value raises. They don't have that many of them, right? But of course, they're not the only opponent in the hand left. So that's something we also have to consider. The next thing we have to consider is how many weak hands does the big blind have? How many hands do they have that would just trivially check fold to any bet size here?
I think they have some. I don't think they have, maybe not many. I think they have some.
So what are they doing here with like a pocket pair between deuces and fives? If you bet.
They're probably folding deuces to, at least deuces to fours. Fives maybe as well.
Well, fives are basically the same as fours here, right? They don't have a straight draw or anything. So yeah, I mean, they're probably folding under pairs, right? If they have any kind of an ace 6 or lower, maybe not ace 6 because it does technically have a straight draw, ace 5 or lower, they're certainly check folding those. They probably do have enough, king highs and lower, king 5 and below, queen 5 and below suited. If they don't have the flush draw, they're just check folding those. So I think at a bare minimum here, they have some auto folds, right? I don't think we need to necessarily assume that they always have some kind of equity, especially considering that some of their very weakest hands here are in that category where they would just never bluff with those hands, whereas some of the draws, maybe they would sometimes bet the turn with those hands. So when they check, they are a lot more weighted in the direction of the weakest portions of their range, which is under pairs, it's ace highs, stuff that will most likely fold to any bet here. So they do have at least some auto folds, and they have very few potential value raises. Now we have to evaluate the button because they have a slightly different range here, of course. How many potential value raises does the button have?
Let's see. Potentially not as many as the big blind, but
Well, we don't have to compare them to the big blind yet. We just have to think about reasonable hands that could raise. If we were to bet, let's say we were to bet kind of an arbitrary sort of small size here, what hands can the button have at this point that could feasibly raise?
they could have quads, they could have
Sure.
full houses.
They have a low frequency of those hands. Yeah. What else?
They probably don't have as many straights. They don't have straights.
Okay. Let's talk about why. You're right, but specifically why do they not have very many straights
Because
here?
the button won't call very wide here.
Okay. Yeah. What else can we reasonably ascertain here that might reduce the number of straights that they could have?
Other than
Think
the exact hands that they don't
Well,
possess.
think about the flop action, right? They check back on the flop. It's reasonable to assume that at least there's at least some likelihood that if they had a hand like Jack 9 with a straight draw, or if they somehow had 9-6 suited pre-flop, then they might bet the flop at some rate, right? So at the very least, because some of their straight draws will bet the flop, we should assume that the likelihood of them having straights on the turn is a bit reduced.
This capped as well.
Yeah, they're somewhat capped as well, right? Both players are somewhat capped here, which is a good thing for us, obviously. Now, the other thing is that if we think about the button in terms of auto folds, well, they have a little bit more of a restricted auto fold region compared to the big blind, because a lot of the stuff the big blind is auto folding, the button doesn't have. But the button also does have some ace highs that just fold. The other thing that's noteworthy, though, is that obviously a lot of hands here can turn some kind of a gut shot. So a lot of broadways that have a jack can turn a gut shot. A lot of hands containing a 9 obviously turn an open ender. A lot of hands containing a 6 can turn a gut shot. There's some flush draws there. So I think the button doesn't have that many auto folds, whereas the big blind does have a decent chunk of them. And I think where we end up as a result of combining all of those things is that I don't think the collective set of opponents that we're up against has that many potential value raises. But I also think that they do have a decent chunk of auto folds. So where I would probably land as far as an overall strategy here would be that I think we can go, medium to largish sort of a size here. I think I would probably have bet a little bit bigger than what you did bet, which is you bet 40%. It's not anywhere near an error to bet 40% here. I probably would have gone something like 2/3, if something of that kind of nature. And then in terms of frequency, I certainly think there's a good chunk of hands that we can bet here. But one of the benefits of the size that you did go with is that we get to bet a little bit more often, a little bit more easily, because we're not going quite as big. That's helpful for us here. Now, we did bet 40% and the button folds, which is nice. And then the big blind calls and we go to the river and we see a jack river. Now, when we're building our strategy on the river, it's a little bit different because we have to really establish very clear sort of value thresholds for, what our range is going to do. Now, it's notable that because the big blind here has quite a high consistency of hands containing a 9 in their check calling range on the turn, they are actually supposed to lead this river quite a lot. If villain has a 9, it's very correct for them to do a lot of leading here and put our overpair type hands in a tough spot. And when they don't lead, we don't really know for sure how to interpret that. We don't really know whether we can have the very high confidence that, for example, they would lead with a lot of their strongest hands. We don't know one way or the other there. But I'm curious, what do you think it was in real time that led you to bet this river with aces?
Not properly ranging them, that they would have bet. They would have let out with their straights. Not giving them credit for having a 9 here.
Okay,
so it's a big part of their range. I think the bet here was really bad. And I'm getting check tools. All I need to do is tap the table.
Sure, I think you're right. But let's also think a little bit about the logic of how we would construct our overall strategy here. The first thing that is quite important to note is that when we're in position on the river, having the opportunity to just check and immediately see a showdown is very valuable. So our bet sizing that we use should quite rarely be in the territory that I think you did use in game, which was, I think you used just under half pot, something like that. It's pretty rare that we want to bet under half pot from in position on the river, just because in order to justify reopening the betting and potentially getting raised, we need to be getting a decent chunk of value from that bet. And in most cases, the downside of reopening the betting and potentially getting raised is significant enough that just making a small value bet like that isn't really worth it unless we're super confident that villain just doesn't really ever raise. So that's kind of the first thing that I would say about the sizing there. But I would also say when it comes to our overall sizing structure in this situation, with the sizing that you picked, or with some sort of a kind of medium bet size on the river there, what hands are we targeting in villain's range? Like, what's some of the stuff that villain is going to have an awkward decision with, or a bluff catching decision with against that size?
Yeah, I'm trying to find a pocket pair or a pair that they would still have here. Maybe Jack X.
Yeah, I mean, there's some Jack X in there. There's some Queen Jack. There's also some 10X in there. I think really 10X is kind of what I was thinking of, in that we have, if there is anything left in that range that we can target to sort of make into a bluff catcher that isn't, that might allow us to value bet an overpair, it would be specifically a 10. But the problem is that when villain has a 10, it's usually going to be a 10 that has a Broadway kicker, in which case it's going to be a little bit hard for them to, in this example, for a good example, we have pocket aces. Well, it's quite hard for them to have ace 10 now, right? So we specifically kind of need them to have exactly like king 10, queen 10, or maybe, I suppose they can have jack 10 because we do counterfeit jack 10 here, which is kind of nice. So that's a possibility. But essentially the downside of getting raised here, or the downside of reopening the betting, is quite significant. So we certainly, I don't think, have much reason to bet the river with a hand like
the hands that
here.
we're targeting is a very, very small.
Yeah, exactly right.
To get value with my aces here. I just I'm too eager to the bet there. The 4-liner is not the 4-liner, but the gut shot.
Yeah,
it's just not good. It's a terrible card for me. And
it's not a great one. I mean, I wouldn't say it's terrible, because what would be the individual card itself is not terrible. What would be terrible, or what would be awkward, is if that card comes out and then you actually face bet, right? Because that would now put your hand in a spot where it's much more indifferent. But facing a check on this river, it's kind of nice, because it's like, okay, I just check and I hope that I win against a 7 or a 10 or something like that, right?
And my current assessment, with the jamming, my idea was looking at, they rivered a straight. I can prevent that by jamming here on the turn. Looking at it in hindsight. But in game, I wasn't thinking that, but because I didn't bet nearly,
but that whole, I think that approach, I see that a ton from people, where they look at a hand and they think, I lost this hand. How could I have theoretically prevented me from losing this hand? It's really problematic to go down that rabbit hole, because there's always things that you could do to prevent yourself from losing a hand. Like, you could have folded aces pre, right? But that doesn't tell you anything meaningful about how you could have potentially made a higher EV decision. So what matters is not at all the fact that villain ended up having a straight. In fact, the way that you played the hand up until the river is completely reasonable. But the two things that are most meaningful about this hand is, number one, we absolutely cannot jam the turn. It's like a crazy punt to jam the turn, because you basically never get
called by.
Yeah, you just only get called when villains are trapping you, right? You don't give them any difficult decisions. Like, I mean, maybe every now and again you get called by some like combo pair plus flush draw type stuff, but like that, you're not even that far ahead of those hands, and you get crushed every time you're up against some kind of trap. And then, so that's the first thing, that there's no spot here where we're just going to jam the turn into 2 players for like 3x pot or whatever it was. And then the second thing is that by far the most important part of this hand is that river node, where you get there and villain checks to you, and you're kind of presented with a really good spot to just tap the table, check, take your equity, hopefully win the pot. But if you lose, like whatever, and we don't take it, like this stuff, in comparison to, in comparison to anything that you could possibly learn from any kind of aggregate report, this type of river decision is so much more valuable, that, like I said, if you never ran another aggregate report and just looked at every single river spot you ever play, I can guarantee you would basically instantly increase your win rate by a significant amount.
And I have to admit, I'm not properly, I play too quickly, I act too quickly, and I don't properly assess what we just did in this hand. I don't properly do that in hand. I'm lazy, mentally lazy doing that. And I just need to have a little more caffeine. And
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's always, I think it's always a tricky, balance to strike when we're in the learning process, because on the one hand, you've got a lot of things that you can do to simplify how you're learning. And I think the way I like to look at it is, you've got the two systems of thought, right? This is from a book I really like, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. You've got system one, which is the rapid, instinctive sort of pattern recognition type of thought process, where you recognize a certain type of situation and you just inherently kind of understand what you're supposed to do in that situation, and you can rapidly think it through. But you've also got the system two process, which is much slower, much more analytical. It's using a lot of verbal reasoning. It's breaking things down step by step. It's having sequential ways of analyzing things. And right now, someone like yourself, who's done a lot of work with aggregate reports, a lot of work with just identifying patterns and things like that, you're going to do a pretty good job of playing according to system one and recognizing intuitively like what probably makes sense according to patterns that you've seen from the sims that you've looked at. But your system two processing is letting you down right now, because in game, you're not thinking things through systematically in a way that's actually arriving at well-rounded strategies and well-rounded decisions, because things are happening that are causing you to look back and say, oh, maybe I should have jammed the turn, when in fact jamming the turn is kind of crazy. And then you're looking at the river and not really recognizing in the moment that this river card, like your system one processing here, ideally, it would be telling you, oh, okay, I can't bet this river. Ideally, it would be in that zone. But it's very difficult to condition your system one thinking to that level of specificity that you can immediately recognize this river card is bad enough for me that I just know I shouldn't bet this hand here. But what you can do is build your system two processing to the point where you understand, just based on working through, okay, what's my opponent's range? What hands am I value betting here? What sizes am I using? Based on all those things, you can arrive at that decision that I cannot value bet a hand like aces, and I'm just going to check. And that's the processes that we want to cultivate right now. It's the processes that are going to make the biggest difference in terms of your win rate, to be able to actually take all of these concepts that you've looked at in other situations that you've applied to some degree, and then be able to use that next level of analytical processing in game to really think things through in detail and have a framework that can help you to build your strategies like this. Because everything you did in this hand up to the river is completely fine. And even the river is not like an egregious punt, but it is an interesting example of a spot where, because it's complex and it's quite specific to your opponents are making mistakes they're making mistakes on the flop and so on. There's all these different variables that we need to consider. So you can't just look at a sim and just execute what the sim tells you here without losing a fair amount of EV. So we have to be able to use that system two process to break this spot down according to all the different variables, which is what we've just done.
Yeah, I think I was just too focused on, when the jack comes up on the river, I'm focused on, oh, maybe he has a jack, maybe he has a 10. Maybe I can target that with a small bet. If he raises me, I'll fold to, if he has the straight. I really wasn't assessing the likelihood that he had a 9, which is pretty great. And he probably doesn't have that much jack X that, I'm targeting a real small range.
Exactly. So that's kind of what it comes down to. You're not wrong that you might be able to target those hands, but the missing ingredient is that those hands are actually only a very small part of villain's range. And what's happening is your system one processing is looking at, I have aces, I can potentially value bet, but you're not zooming out into the bigger picture, which is that aces is not actually that strong of a hand right now based on the ranges, right? So this is kind of how we want to keep cultivating this going forward. So I think this is a good process to be continuing to implement. And what I want to start fleshing out next time is to look at the actual hand level decision making and start to get more of a sense of how we are actually making decisions with individual hands once we've decided what our range strategy looks like. So that would be probably the next step. And it would be, if you do have the ability to note down any hands between now and next time, anything like that, even if you want to just immediately, as soon as you play a hand, just write it in our Discord channel, that's completely fine. Like that's kind of partly why those channels exist.
Yeah, I have the hand history keyboard on my phone. I've had it for years, and it's
there
like
you go.
I know, but I don't use it.
Right. So what we want to cultivate, so what we want to build is ideally a process where as soon as you get into an interesting hand, just post it on our Discord. Just do that instantly. Just like try to remind yourself every time, like, oh, that was interesting. Let's post it. So just so that I can see it and give you some immediate feedback, but also so that we can have it there as something that can provide a platform for us to actually analyze.
I've always had very poor recall, like as far as someone tells you their name, they can tell me 5 times in a row. No, I won't.
I get it. I completely get it. But
my mind kind of goes on to the, it does go on to analyzing the hand right away.
Yeah.
But I have to, the specifics, as soon as I don't know the suits, as soon as I don't know the bet sizing, then I kind of lose interest in reporting the hand.
The key there is you just have to do it immediately after the hand ends, right? Like it just when it's as fresh as possible in your mind, like just write it in our Discord, have Discord on your phone and just have it open so that it takes you like 10 seconds to just write the details of a hand down.
I'll commit to getting a hand, at least one hand every week.
Sounds good. That's a great starting point. Excellent. All right. Well, that is a good place to wrap for today, I think. So
do I need to look over that sheet that you're going to talk about next week? I guess I'll just clip it from the
no, I want to introduce that and talk it through as we go. So don't worry about anything between now and next time. Just keep running the sims that you're running, but also just focus your energy on recording hands and just trying to implement that process, because having hands to look at is going to be an important thing for us going forward, just to make sure that I can get some visibility on some of these turn and river spots and what's the most useful for you.
Yeah, really excited about, a little disappointed about where I'm ending up after all these years.
Well, it's just one of those things. Like we gain greater ability to study the game over time. There's a lot of things that when you first started, I'm sure things that we didn't really have the ability to even figure out strategically. So technology advances and we learn new things about the game all the time, but there's still, there's obviously plenty of opportunity to kind of get to a point of feeling confident about your knowledge. So I wouldn't sweat it too much.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sounds good.
Have a good
all right.
week.
You too. See ya. But thanks. Bye-bye.